The dawn of the 19th century did not rise with the clang of swords or the call of conquest, but with the hiss of steam and the hum of machines. Across the skies of England, smoke billowed like dark banners of a new empire, not built on land, but on industry. In towns like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool, iron wheels turned endlessly, looms rattled like drums of progress, and furnaces glowed with the promise of a new age. Trade, that ancient force which had once depended on camel caravans and monsoon winds, now found itself at the mercy of pistons, gears, and coal. The Industrial Revolution was not merely a technological shift, it was a transformation of how the world exchanged its wealth. Old routes crumbled, new ones were forged, and entire nations were redrawn by the rhythm of steam. This is the story of how factories replaced fields, how oceans became highways of iron, and how the heartbeat of global trade quickened until it echoed from the docks of London to the harbors of Shanghai. It began quietly, in the damp valleys of 18th-century Britain, where inventors tinkered with pumps and mills to drain coal mines. James Watt's steam engine, perfected in the 1770s, became the spark that lit the furnace of change. For the first time, power could be harnessed not from muscle, wind, or water, but from burning coal, a fuel that seemed limitless beneath Britain's soil. Factories sprang up like fortresses of iron. Textile mills transformed raw cotton from India and the American South into finished cloth at a pace the world had never seen. The spinning jenny, the power loom, and the steam engine turned Britain into what would soon be called the workshop of the world. But with production came hunger, a hunger for raw materials, for markets, and for movement. Goods needed to be transported faster than ever before. Canals were dug, bridges built, and by the early 19th century, the first railways began to weave their iron threads across the land. Trade, once governed by distance and season, was now measured by speed. If the steam engine had changed the factory, the steam locomotive changed the world. In 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway carried the first steam-hauled passengers. Within decades, railways crisscrossed Britain, then Europe, India, and the Americas. Goods that once took weeks to move by cart could now be shipped in hours. The very geography of trade was rewritten. Cities that stood near railway lines thrived, while those left behind withered. At the same time, steamships began to challenge the supremacy of sail. No longer at the mercy of the wind, captains could now chart direct courses through oceans and rivers. Iron hulls replaced wooden decks, coal replaced canvas. The journey from London to Calcutta, once a perilous 6-month voyage around Africa, could now be made in less than half that time. This mechanized mobility created what historians call the shrinking world. Distances seemed shorter, the world more connected. Steam did not just move goods, it compressed time. By mid-century, the great industrial powers, Britain, France, and soon Germany and the United States, were no longer content to trade within Europe. They looked outward, toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, hungry for new markets and new dominions. Industrialization and colonization were twin engines driving the same machine. The factories of Manchester depended on cotton from India and the American South. The mills of Lancashire turned that cotton into textiles, which were then sold back to colonies at a profit. It was a system designed to extract, manufacture, and export, a global cycle of dependence. The British Empire became the first industrial superpower, not only through invention but through domination. The colonial ports of Bombay, Calcutta, Singapore, and Cape Town became cogs in this expanding network. Railways, telegraph lines, and ports were built across colonies, not for local prosperity, but to serve imperial trade. Each new invention deepened this web of control. The steamship allowed Britain to reach its colonies faster. The telegraph, introduced in the 1840s, allowed instant communication across oceans. A message that once took months by letter could now be sent in minutes, the world's first taste of globalization. Meanwhile, European rivals followed. France expanded into North Africa and Indochina. Belgium took the Congo. The Dutch held Indonesia. The industrial hunger for rubber, tin, palm oil, and minerals turned Africa and Asia into open veins feeding European factories. Trade had become empire, empire had become trade. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of transformation was taking root. The United States, once a cluster of colonies, emerged from its civil war in the mid-19th century ready to industrialize at lightning speed. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, stitched the vast continent together from coast to coast. American industry grew with ferocity. Steel, oil, and textiles became the pillars of its economy. Cities like Pittsburgh, Chicago, and New York hummed with the sound of progress. With each passing decade, America shifted from an importer to an exporter of industrial might. Steamships carried American wheat to Europe, while European immigrants sailed back to work in American factories. It was a circle of movement, people, goods, and capital, faster and wider than the world had ever known. By the late 19th century, America joined Britain as a global industrial power, its exports feeding markets in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Trade was no longer confined to the Old World. The entire planet had become a marketplace. In 1869, an event occurred that forever altered global trade, the opening of the Suez Canal. Cut through the sands of Egypt, this narrow channel connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, linking Europe directly to the Indian Ocean. For the first time in history, ships no longer needed to sail around Africa to reach Asia. The voyage from London to Bombay was reduced by nearly 6,000 kilometers. The Suez Canal became the beating heart of 19th-century commerce. Steamships, powered by coal, could now move continuously between Europe and Asia. Britain's control of Egypt, and later the canal itself, ensured its dominance over global maritime routes. The Canal Age marked a new era of human engineering, soon followed by the Panama Canal in the early 20th century. These canals were more than waterways, they were symbols of the industrial world's conquest over geography. Yet this triumph came at a cost. Nations that lacked colonies or fleets found themselves marginalized. The industrial powers tightened their grip on global trade, while traditional trading centers, once vital on the old land routes, sank into obscurity. The bazaars of Aleppo, the caravans of Samarkand, and the ports of Aden were now bypassed by ships that steamed past their shores. By the late 1800s, a second wave of industrial innovation transformed the world once again. The discovery of electric power, the invention of the telephone, and the development of steel manufacturing changed both production and trade. Goods could now be produced on an unprecedented scale, and shipped to every corner of the earth. Corporations replaced small merchants. Stock exchanges grew into engines of global finance. International banks and insurance houses, like Barings, Rothschilds, and Lloyds of London, made trade safer and faster. Telegraph cables, laid across the Atlantic seabed, turned the oceans into conduits of information. For the first time in history, the world's markets moved in unison. The new industrial powers, Germany, the United States, and Japan, began to challenge Britain's dominance. Germany's factories in the Ruhr and Saxony produced chemicals, machinery, and weapons. Japan, after the Meiji Restoration, 1868, modernized at astonishing speed, transforming from an isolated feudal state into a mechanized empire. Competition bred tension. Industrialization had made the world smaller, but it had also made it more volatile. Each empire sought to control raw materials and markets, leading to rivalries that would soon explode into global conflict. Behind the smoke-streaked skylines and gleaming ships lay the human side of the industrial age, one of immense suffering and dislocation. Factories consumed labor as they did coal. In Britain's cities, children worked 12-hour shifts in textile mills, miners toiled in darkness for pennies a day. The same steam that powered global trade also powered colonial exploitation. Millions of Indians, Africans, and Southeast Asians were forced into plantations or mines to supply Europe's factories. The Opium Wars between Britain and China revealed how trade could become a weapon, forcing open markets at the barrel of a gun. Industrialization promised prosperity, but its rewards were unevenly distributed. For every merchant prince who gained a fortune, there were countless laborers who paid for progress with their lives. And yet, amid this struggle, the world's population began to migrate as never before. Steamships carried millions of Europeans to the Americas, and Asian laborers to colonies in the Pacific. The world's peoples were mixing, economically, culturally, and demographically, in ways that would reshape the coming century. By the dawn of the 20th century, the threads of trade connected every continent. Coal and steel, cotton and rubber, tea and tobacco, oil and machinery, these commodities crisscrossed the globe in an endless cycle of production and consumption. The great ports, London, Liverpool, New York, Bombay, Shanghai, Singapore, and Cape Town, became the beating hearts of the global economy. Telegraph lines linked them all, sending daily prices and orders. The stock markets of Europe responded to harvests in India or strikes in America. For the first time, the fate of nations was economically intertwined. Trade had become more than exchange, it was the nervous system of civilization. The Industrial Revolution had given humanity the power to move goods, people, and information at unprecedented speed, but it had also created the dependence that would define the modern age. Even as trade expanded, cracks began to appear beneath the iron surface of empire. Colonies grew restless under the weight of exploitation. Industrialization had spread knowledge and communication, and with it, ideas of freedom and nationalism. In India, the textile mills that once clothed the world were destroyed by British imports. In China, foreign powers carved spheres of influence through unequal treaties. In Africa, borders were drawn by European hands with no regard for the people within them. Trade, which had once connected the world, was now also dividing it, between the industrialized and the exploited, the imperial and the colonized. The very success of industrial trade contained the seeds of resistance. By the end of the 19th century, the world stood on the brink of change once more. The machines that had built empires were now forging discontent, and the nations that had profited most from trade were preparing for competition not in markets, but on battlefields. The industrial age had redrawn the map of the world. It had replaced caravans with steamships, markets with factories, and empires with economies. The rhythms of trade now followed the pulse of machines, steady, relentless, mechanical. And yet, beneath the din of progress, the same ancient truth remained: trade was the lifeblood of human civilization. From the Silk Road to the Suez Canal, from the spinning wheel to the steel mill, humanity's drive to connect, to exchange, had endured. The industrial age did not end the story of trade, it merely changed its language. Iron and coal replaced silk and spice, steam replaced the camel, telegraphs replaced the messenger. But the story continued, now faster, louder, and more complex, as the world hurtled toward a new century of invention, revolution, and global conflict. The 20th century began with the hum of machines and the optimism of progress. Steamships cut across the oceans with mechanical precision, railways stitched continents together, and telegraph wires carried words faster than ships could sail. The industrial empires of Europe stood at the height of their power. London, Paris, and Berlin were the capitals of a world seemingly united by commerce. Goods, people, and ideas flowed through ports and markets with an energy unmatched in history. Yet beneath this glittering web of global trade, tensions brewed. The same industrial might that had built factories and railways had also forged cannons, warships, and rifles. Rival empires, hungry for resources and markets, eyed one another across oceans and continents. The engines of progress were about to turn into instruments of destruction. The world that entered 1914 was a world bound together by trade, and within a few years, that network would unravel in fire, blockade, and ruin. At the dawn of the 20th century, the global economy seemed unstoppable. The British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the Earth's surface and maintained the world's most extensive trading network. The gold standard anchored currencies in stability, and global shipping was cheaper and faster than ever before. Steamships carried tea from India, rubber from Malaya, and wheat from Canada to the ports of London and Liverpool. Other nations, too, were rising. Germany had transformed itself into a mighty industrial power, exporting machinery, chemicals, and precision instruments. The United States, rich in natural resources and driven by innovation, was rapidly becoming the factory of the world. Meanwhile, Japan, newly industrialized after the Meiji Restoration, emerged as a trading power in Asia, challenging European dominance in the East. The world's great ports, London, Hamburg, New York, Bombay, Shanghai, throbbed with the rhythm of global commerce. Steamships passed one another in the Suez Canal, carrying cargoes that fed an interconnected world. Empires competed, but their merchants profited together. Trade was the invisible thread that held their ambitions in balance. But this delicate system depended on peace, and peace was fragile. Beneath the prosperity, national rivalries, colonial competition, and military alliances were hardening. The same railways that carried goods could swiftly carry troops. The same factories that made locomotives could forge guns and shells. When war finally came, it tore the fabric of trade apart. The end of the golden age of trade in the summer of 1914, the world's most advanced nations marched to war. It was a war no one had truly foreseen, industrial, total, and global in scope. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was the spark, but the fire had been smoldering for decades. Trade routes that had once carried goods now carried soldiers and weapons. Merchant ships were seized or sunk, ports became naval strongholds. The British Royal Navy, once the protector of commerce, now enforced a blockade against Germany, cutting off vital imports of food and raw materials. In response, German submarines prowled the Atlantic, sinking Allied and neutral ships alike. The result was devastation for global trade. The shipping lanes that had tied continents together were now battlefields. Insurance costs soared, merchant fleets dwindled, and neutral nations found their commerce entangled in the politics of war. Economies turned inward. Governments seized control of production to fuel the war machine. Factories that had produced textiles or tools were converted to make shells and uniforms. Trade, once the symbol of peace and connection, became an instrument of survival. The war also redrew the map of empires. The Ottoman Empire, long a bridge between East and West, collapsed, leaving behind new nations in the Middle East. The Russian Empire fell to revolution, its trade frozen by civil war. Europe, the heart of world commerce, was left bleeding and bankrupt. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, the old world of open trade and global movement had vanished. In its place stood tariffs, blockades, and debts that would haunt the world for decades. The years following the First World War were marked by both hope and fragility. The League of Nations promised peace, and the victors sought to rebuild the shattered world. Ships once again sailed with cargo, and factories resumed production. But beneath the surface, the wounds of war had not healed. Europe's economies were crippled by debt and inflation. The Treaty of Versailles demanded immense reparations from Germany, strangling its industry. The United States, now the world's leading creditor, grew rich while Europe struggled to recover. The once interconnected trade system became fragmented. Nations turned inward, seeking to protect their industries through tariffs and trade barriers. The United States passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, triggering retaliatory measures worldwide. International trade plummeted by more than 60%. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, deepened this collapse. Banks failed, factories closed, and unemployment soared. The great ports of the world fell silent. The global trade network, once a symbol of modern progress, had crumbled into isolation and distrust. At the same time, new powers sought to reshape the trade order through force. Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Imperial Japan all pursued autarky, economic self-sufficiency, and expansion. Trade was no longer about exchange, it was about control. The stage was set for a new and even deadlier conflict. When war erupted again in 1939, it did so with an intensity unimaginable to the previous generation. This was not merely a European war, it was a struggle for global dominance. Trade routes, colonies, and resources were once again the prizes of battle. Germany's invasion of Poland triggered a chain of declarations that engulfed the world. Soon, the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans became vast arenas of naval warfare. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war of trade. Allied convoys fought to carry food, oil, and weapons from America to Britain while German U-boats sought to starve the island into submission. In the Pacific, Japan's empire expanded swiftly, seizing colonies rich in oil, rubber, and tin. The capture of Singapore, the Philippines, and Dutch Indonesia cut off vital supply lines to the west. For the first time in centuries, the colonial powers found themselves outmaneuvered in the east. Factories across the world turned into arsenals. The United States' vast industrial power, the arsenal of democracy, poured out planes, tanks, and ships in unimaginable quantities. Production became a weapon as powerful as any bomb. Civilian trade all but vanished. Merchant ships were requisitioned, and ports were militarized. The economies of Europe and Asia were consumed by total war. Millions of tons of cargo were sunk beneath the seas, millions of people were displaced or enslaved in forced labor. When the war finally ended in 1945, the old empires that had once dominated global trade lay in ruins. Britain was exhausted, its colonies restless. France and the Netherlands faced rebellions in Asia. Germany and Japan were occupied and shattered. The global balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The end of the Second World War did not restore the old trade order, it destroyed it forever. The European empires that had ruled the seas for centuries were collapsing. In Asia and Africa, independence movements surged. India won its freedom in 1947, Indonesia in 1949, and dozens of other nations would follow. For the first time in centuries, the centers of global trade began to move away from the colonial capitals. A new order, dominated by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerged. The United States, untouched by the devastation of war, became the new anchor of global commerce. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 laid the foundations for a new economic system. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank were created to stabilize currencies and finance reconstruction. The US dollar replaced gold as the global standard. Meanwhile, the Marshall Plan poured billions into rebuilding Europe, reviving industry and trade. American factories, now the most powerful on earth, exported goods across a world hungry for reconstruction. The Soviet Union, by contrast, built its own closed economic system, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, linking Eastern Europe in a network of trade isolated from the capitalist world. The globe was now divided, not into colonies and empires, but into economic and ideological blocs. Trade became a tool of diplomacy and dominance in the Cold War that followed. The two world wars had done more than destroy lives and empires, they had rewired the world's economic soul. The idea of open, free-flowing global trade had died in 1914 and was only cautiously reborn after 1945. The age-old trade routes, the Silk Road, the sea lanes of empire, the colonial circuits of goods and labor, had vanished or transformed. Airplanes replaced caravans. Container ships replaced clipper sails. Multinational corporations replaced imperial monopolies. But out of the wreckage came lessons. The world's leaders, haunted by depression and war, sought to prevent a repeat of the chaos. International cooperation became the new creed. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, founded in 1947, marked the first step toward the globalized trade system that would define the late 20th century. The collapse of the old order, with its empires, monopolies, and colonial hierarchies, gave birth to a new one rooted in interdependence. Yet the scars of the past remained: economic inequality, the lingering shadow of empire, and the memory of how fragile global connection could be.